After over 12 years of working in Pro Tools, I'm moving to Cubase, and here are my first impressions. I worked in a few different DAWs. When I was starting, I used Sonar, I used Ableton, I used Cubase, Logic of course, and Pro Tools. Then when I done a stint at ACM, Academy of Contemporary Music in Guildford, we had a unit dedicated to Pro Tools, and our tutors, professionals from the industry, said if you want to have a career in the industry, you've got to learn Pro Tools. And at that time, when I dived into Pro Tools, I was still using Logic as my DAW for music writing and Pro Tools for everything else. But throughout that time, I decided to consolidate everything and move everything to Pro Tools. The reason a lot of people were using Logic is because Pro Tools had this reputation of not being really great with MIDI, which was true, but there was quite a few updates over the years, and I was also moving towards more post-production rather than music, so Pro Tools was the software of my choice. After that, I got a job at the movie studio as a dialogue editor, and then, of course, Pro Tools was the bedrock of everything, the templates, the editing, the mixing, and so on. After I left that job and moved on to podcasting, I took Pro Tools with me. When I started writing music for podcasts, for CaseFile in particular, I was doing it in Pro Tools, so I had my template set up for dialogue and for music making, for scoring. And at that time, it wasn't as complicated, so I was using Omnisphere, I was using some other synth-based virtual instruments. The MIDI in Pro Tools was okay, and I got proficient in it as well. At the time, Pro Tools updated their program with commit MIDI and some other functions that helped me to stay in that particular DAW. As CaseFile Presents grew, I started to experiment with my music writing more, and it got to the point that I really wanted to start orchestral writing. I've done a few courses online, and I decided to sign up for masters in composition and dive deep into orchestral writing, where I can sort of experiment for CaseFile Presents shows. Remember that I was still using Pro Tools for all my work. As I bought my S88 keyboard and Native Instruments libraries, I've designed my Pro Tools orchestral template. We can have a look at it now. So I've designed my Pro Tools orchestral template with over 300 tracks, and as you can see, I had sections for woodwinds, brass, percussion, strings, and so on. Within the folders, I had different instruments from that section, and then within that folder, I had all these different articulations. I focused on BBC Symphony Orchestra from Spitfire, but also if we scroll down, I had my Omnisphere, and I've also used ensemble patches. I've used patches from Native Instruments and others, like XLN. Everything went into groups that were sent into my reverbs, then audio stems that could then be recorded onto a stereo mix. So that was the template where I started to create cues in it, but also start doing assignments for my masters. As I started working in Pro Tools and designing these bigger orchestral cues, I started to notice the shortcomings of Pro Tools when it came to MIDI. And there were a few things that were a little bit clunky and a little bit annoying. And not only that, with latest updates, there were bugs, and they were sort of kind of session-breaking bugs. Stuff like you couldn't select MIDI note, things to do with changing durations of MIDI notes, and lately I've been getting these CPU overloads. Even when I made majority of the tracks inactive and only had a few active, I would still get these crashes. Remember also that Pro Tools is still running under Rosetta, not as M1, but we'll get to that a little bit later too. So I start to think maybe it's time to move, especially with the big template like that. So I started doing a lot of research. At that point, I understand and I knew that a lot of orchestral composers work in Cubase. Of course, the biggest name out there is Hans Zimmer, but the other side prefer Logic. So really it was a choice between these two. Before I decided on one of them, I wanted to test both of them. And one of the requirements was I needed to make my S1 from Avid work with both of them as a controller, and they do use it, so it works quite well. 2, it was my monogram console, which I use for dynamics, and also I wanted the future DAW of my choice to work with it. Both work with their fine. Then it was time to decide Cubase or Logic. Logic Pro had 90 days trial, and Cubase, I think it has 30 days. So I've downloaded both Logic and Cubase. And the plan was to test it on a simple session first, maybe import some MIDI from my Pro Tools sessions, and then choose one and build that big orchestral template. So the first one that I started with was Logic, because I've used it extensively in the past, so I was familiar with the UI a little bit more than with Cubase. So from the beginning, Logic, it has a nice intuitive UI. It's all Apple now, so it's kind of easy to operate in. Of course, the style is subjective to taste, but the first thing that I wanted to try is how the nesting works. So imagine these are my tracks like violin 1, violin 1 staccato, whatever. We can create a track stack, which is like a folder. It's a folder track. We call them strings. But now, imagine that within that folder, we want to create another one of these stacks. And this is for violins. Let's say these are different articulations. Now, when I'm creating that, it only allows me to do a summing stack, which is like a patch, but that's not what I want. I want a folder with different articulations. I don't want them to be summed. And unfortunately, that's the only way. So there is a lack of deep track nesting in Logic. So that was one. There are some workarounds online that I found, but I was like, I don't want to do workarounds when I'm moving to a different DAW. 2 was I couldn't find a quick way to search for tracks. So let's say I've got 30 tracks and I click, you want to find staccato violin, pizzicato viola. I couldn't find it, so maybe someone can enlighten me there. And then 3, when we write automation in Logic, yes, you can adjust the MIDI and velocity and so on quite nicely, but I didn't like the way you write the velocity with this sort of straight line. I thought, okay, there are a few different things that annoy me from the get-go with Logic. Let's try Cubase. With Cubase, the program had a few things going for it. One is M1 native, I'll talk about it in a second. 2, yes, it's more complex, but also it gives you more flexibility when it comes to UI. And also it's the OG in MIDI, so clearly they know what they're doing. And like I said, a lot of orchestral composers use Cubase as their choice for DAW. So straight away, when I imported MIDI from Pro Tools to Cubase, the process was really easy. And then when I played the session, that section, which had quite a few instruments, it worked really, really well. So I decided, okay, let's give it a go, and I'll spend a couple days building my orchestral template in Cubase. That's what I've done. So as you can see here, it kind of replicated what I had in Pro Tools with a little bit of a caveat and change, but essentially it's the same. We are nesting brass, instruments and articulations. So woodwinds, a lot of different instruments, strings, and different articulations, as you can see. And then we're going into our group tracks. We also have some reverbs that we can send from group tracks, and we're ending up within the stems. Of course, this is work in progress, especially the color coding, etc. But I've decided, okay, I still got like a week or so in that trial. I'm gonna do the next assignment for my school in Cubase, purely in Cubase, and also do some cues in Cubase as well. The template is working okay. I had some issues with routing because it's a little bit different to Pro Tools. I mean, the fundamentals are the same. It's about setting it up that's slightly different. But other than that, that's what I will be doing for a while. And what are my first impressions and what am I doing to speed up my process of learning new software like that after so many years of being stuck in my ways? To speed up my learning process, one, I'll be doing the next assignment purely in Cubase. That's assignment for my masters, and I also be doing some sketches and cues for next CaseFile Presents shows in Cubase. What this allows me to do, it puts a little bit of pressure on me. I'm not going through a manual. Like I'm not going to read like 400 pages of the manual. Rather, I'm moving the same workflow I had for years to Cubase, and then I hit the wall. So I've got research. I jump on the internet, on Google, on some forums, and I'm researching and I'm writing it down. Two is, of course, shortcuts. Now, I've got my Pro shortcuts memorized. I've used them for years. Cubase, there are different key commands. There's different shortcuts I've got learned. So I've got the sheet of paper when I'm writing down the shortcuts that I'm already using. Then it'll be about learning the new environment, adjusting that new environment, which can take months. Now I'm not moving completely to Cubase. At the end of my template, I had my stem tracks. So the idea is that I will compose with MIDI in Cubase, record it on the stem tracks, and then export these audio stereo stem tracks, import them to my Pro Tools mixing session and mix it there. I still think that Pro Tools is the best software for editing, mixing, recording. I don't do much recording, but in these areas I'm very proficient with Pro Tools, and also it's a great DAW. However, for big orchestral templates, for scoring templates, I don't think Pro Tools is the best one. At least that's what I found. That's why I am moving, and I'm moving to Cubase. Do you find this video helpful? Well, hit subscribe and you can become a better audio producer, just like me. There's another thing, that Pro Tools is still not M1 native, so I have to run it under Rosetta, which is fine. But there are some crashes, there are some issues still going on. Now Cubase is M1 native. There's some caveats to that as well. Not only all the plugins and your virtual instruments have to be M1 native if you want to run them in Cubase, but also on Mac, in M1 native version, Cubase drops support for VST2. Meaning not only your virtual instruments and plugins have to be M1 native, but they also have to be VST3. Now, thankfully, 2 days ago, Native Instruments released an update for complete control, which means I can use my keyboard, transport keys and all, in a native version of Cubase, plus VST3 support. Others, BBC Symphony Orchestra, yeah, that works. So that's majority of my template already done. However, there are some other instruments like Addictive Drummer or XL from XLN that are M1 native, but not VST3. Meaning when I run Cubase as a native version, they will not work. So I have to run them under Rosetta. But because I'm not using Addictive Drummer and XO as often, I might actually run it as native version for the orchestral, for Omnispheres and so on, and only if I need to add some beat to it, then I run it under Rosetta too. I've also spoken to support from XLN, and they said they did release VST3 version, but there were some issues with it, so they're working to resolve it. They will release it in the future. Avites 1 seems fine with Cubase. My monogram for dynamics also, I've already set up a little custom template for all the little faders I got there. I need to start it as a native, see if the control buttons on my S88 work fine. These are my first impressions. Now it's time for testing, learning, and really diving deep into this new software. It'll take months to settle in. The idea is I'm splitting now. Pro Tools always have its place with audio, but now, well, Cubase, let's hope it'll do great with MIDI.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, check out the next one, and we'll see you soon.